Thank you for joining me today. The SCP Wiki is a lost media factory. The vast majority of the content that's submitted to scpwiki.com is permanently deleted, and for most of SCP's history across all platforms, no serious thought was being made to backups. Because of the limitations of Wikidot, on the SCP Wiki, article deletion means permanent hard deletion. So that means that unless it was backed up in a mean-spirited bad SCP collection, or it was up long enough to be caught in the Wayback Machine, the cold posts all melt away like tears in the rain. But that's not why you're here, right? The nameless ocean of lost SCP material isn't exactly a compelling or tragic loss. By and large, they were low-effort retreads of the worn-out creepypasta tropes SCP shed years ago. Here are lost and found instances of SCP lost media. The Saddest Necrophile. The Saddest Necrophile was a co-production of Vogt and Valynx. As the story goes, Vogt had been shopping what was described as the worst possible concept to multiple potential co-authors, all of whom declined. Eventually, Valynx and he were the ones who collaborated on the piece. And a warning for those who might be sensitive to topics of rape and adjacent to rape. The idea was that the Saddest Necrophile is a man who, when he has sex with dead bodies, his semen brings people back to life. Then, in the article, the ethics committee approves him using it to bring important operatives back to life. But he's heterosexual and doesn't like having sex with the male corpses, so they have to do other things to keep him engaged. It was obviously disgusting and was quickly washed away in a wave of downvotes, earning instant notoriety. Valynx, who had previously come under consideration for the senior staff, became a pariah who left the community shortly afterwards. Vogt, who had always been sort of a strange duck, didn't really see the needle move much in terms of what people thought about him. Take that as you will. The text of the Saddest Necrophile might be saved somewhere, but it hasn't been seen on the wiki since 2012. Google searches produce only references to it being made on the SCP Wiki forums and elsewhere. The only quote we have of the thread comes from a form of a mod post by the Deadly Moose, trying to cool down a fight in the comments section between Valynx and another site user who goes by the Zaz. Guys, please address how much the article does or doesn't suck, not how much the author, another poster does or doesn't suck, or whether they're doing anything or saying something that does or doesn't suck. Thanks. No lines of conversation are being officially closed by this post, but any further conversation targeted at a person rather than this article and its merits may be subject to moderative action, at staff discretion, but especially if it's a personal attack. Other staff reading this, please PM me if there's more going on I don't know about. My internet is preventing me from signing on to IRC at this time. On that note, if other staff choose to close down certain conversations here or after my tying this up, that will supersede this post. Your favorite fascist overlords thank you for your cooperation. The source of Does the Black Moon Howl is one of the most enigmatic questions in the entire SCP canon. It was popularized by SCP Administrator Troy L., who claims to have gotten it from a set of stories that had all been deleted long ago, and the line was the only good piece to be plucked from any of it. Other than his testimony, we don't know what the stories were about, who wrote them, or when they were even around. BB Aztec's last article. Another case of an article that went up and down before it could be properly archived. BB Aztec's last piece was described by one who remembered it as a pervasive invasion of film media with a lost girl hinted to be the red glow at the end of a Sopranos DVD, and the recursive basketball tape. Incredible Twin Peak vibes. It's been my white whale ever since. Fishmongering authors. Fishmongering is the practice of removing oneself from the SCP Wiki and demanding that staff remove all of your content at the same time. Throughout time, multiple authors have followed in the original Fishmonger's example to pull their works from the SCP Wiki, hence the name. While there is nothing to prevent these works from being posted elsewhere, the chilling effect of their prescription for being posted on the SCP Wiki means there is little interest in reposting them elsewhere, and what little that remains online by way of readings and other media may soon be all that's left of them. Global Occult Coalition Wiki. Around the same time that SCP admins Pair of Ducks and Dr. Everett Mann were creating the Wanderer's Library spin-off site, Elana and Dr. Clef are cooking up the Global Occult Coalition's own version. While the library managed to form a series of small but dedicated communities to it over the years, the GOC wiki never took off and was eventually merged back into the SCP wiki. Most of the materials that are around in the GOC Group of Interest file come from this wiki, at least in the seeding, but they will never again appear the way they did in the framework of the GOC wiki. That is gone for good. Unfinished Business Part 3. Almost a meta-joke at this point. Troy has teased releasing the long-awaited final chapter of his epic trilogy for many years now. While there is an Unfinished Business Part 3 story up on the wiki, it is little more than a URL placeholder and a bad joke. The real story, if it ever will see the light of day, exists only in the possession of Troy. And now, for the found media.
So when I went to find 603's video, the first thing I did was I went to its page and checked the page source. That included a link to an external URL, pleasesendhelp.com, which I assume is the author's personal site since their username is PSH. So I checked pleasesendhelp.com and the site is gone. I assume they stopped paying for hosting. So the video is also gone. Of course, nothing's really gone on the internet, so I decided to check the Wayback Machine at web.archive.org. And I checked its archives for pleasesendhelp.com. I also checked its archives for pleasesendhelp.com/SCP because it was in a subdirectory called SCP. The first one didn't have a link to the SCP archive, and then the other one, I got a 403 forbidden error. So then I figured maybe it's stored under the exact URL of the video, which is scp-603-115-cap.flv. So I searched that on the Wayback Machine, and it says it doesn't have that URL. But it does have a link that says, click here to search for all archive pages under pleasesendhelp.com/SCP. And what that brought me to is an archive with two URLs that have been captured for it. One is actually the video for SCP-603, and the other is the audio file for SCP-216. 216 audio is also hosted on pleasesendhelp.com.
And finally, of course, the ultimate example of SCP lost media. The original 4chan thread for the SCP Foundation is archived on the Blue Soul archives. It's incredible that something that was posted over a decade ago that nobody knew would be significant at the time would survive like this. If it can be found, so can